Yeah, I'm sorry, not yesterday, Friday. Friday was about the different types of law, right? So I give you a definition of law. I explained that eternal law, like the logos, that's God's own mind, okay? So it's not like thoughts that are separate from him, but it's how he conducts the world. Then I talked about divine law, how that's present in the Revelation, divine revelation, so Old Testament, New Testament. I talked about positive or civil law, and I said how that needs to be grounded both in natural law and has to be square with divine law. And then I talked about natural law, and I said that was man's participation in eternal law. So this is a way that, remember, in our mythos, we have a God who shares his nature with us. And in the sharing of that nature, we too then can participate in his eternal law. So today we're going to expand on natural law. My experience has been that, often at this level, when you're a junior in high school in a class on Catholic morality, you're often getting very condensed information. In other words, this is natural law. This can be a course, an entire semester course. You're getting just what I could fit into 30 minutes. That's true with almost everything that we teach here in morality. So my experience has been that sometimes students find it uncompelling. Like, well, I don't know if I really agree with that. I'm only asking a little humility on your part that you're getting very little of it. Okay, so don't be making such a sound judgment. An example would be, if a person did have cancer, they would trust an oncologist. They wouldn't trust WebMD. So in things like this that also require quite a bit of education, just what a person thinks or what you read on the internet, if it doesn't square with this, bring the same level of scrutiny to bear. So I need open minds all around. So we're going to talk about precepts of natural law. I'm going to show how it's a bridge to the modern world, to the world altogether, and then I'll give you very specific historical examples. Yes. Okay, so first off, I'm going to say about how natural law is imprinted on the human person. Now, by imprinted, how is it built into our design? How do we go about, working through natural law? So it's imprinted on us in two ways. One is rational knowledge. Okay? So I need you to think. If anybody thought that you're going to have to come in here and just simply agree with what I say, I need you to think. So what do we do with rational knowledge? We form judgments, do we not? We understand concepts. I need you to do that. So rational knowledge, and the second thing is rational knowledge and natural inclinations. There are inclinations within our nature that we can know. We are going to look at those inclinations here very shortly. So we're going to say the two ways that natural law is imprinted on the human person is rational knowledge and natural inclinations. So I need you to think, and I need you to look at our design, and then we're going to make conclusions based on those two things. First is the primary precepts. There are 5. Do good is not the full inclination. If you only write that down on a quiz, you will get it wrong. So it is do good and avoid evil. Do good and avoid evil. Nobody has to tell you that. These are the things that you cannot not know. That is a purposeful double negative. Do good and avoid evil. Why do we know that that's true? Because when you do something wrong, you want to lie about it. Nobody lies if they didn't think there was something wrong with not doing good. Even a toddler who might steal cookies with chocolate around his lips says, I didn't do it, because they try to cover what they've done. Nobody covers something unless they know they should not have done it. This, do good and avoid evil, is also known as the first principle of morality. You will need to know that. The first principle of morality is do good and avoid evil. We can never do evil that good may come from it. You can't beat somebody to a pulp for their sneakers. But getting your sneakers are good, yes, and you use an evil means to get to it. You can never do evil that good may come of it. One other thing you need to know about this is also known as the principle of beneficence. to do good and avoid evil. Have you ever heard, you may have heard this because it's part of the Hippocratic Oath, avoid, first do no harm. Ever hear that? Like a doctor says, first do no harm. You don't need to know, but that's the principle of maleficence. To do good and avoid evil is the principle of beneficence. All right? It is the first principle of morality. The second inclination is that you seek truth. And you know this is something that nobody needs to tell you. Because how many times do we try to investigate, are they lying to us? Or we ask, really? Are you sure? Are you positive? Seriously? You would never say any of those things unless you were inclined to the truth. If you were indifferent to the truth, you would never ask a question. You would never investigate anything. All right? No one has to tell you or I to seek truth. It's something we cannot not know. No one has to tell you to preserve your own life. You don't get to a certain age, okay, you're in 4th grade now, so now you're old enough to know. You want to try the best to stay alive. Nobody's to tell you that. If you're a little kid and somebody pushes you into the water, you don't stay there passively. I'm not talking about an infant. I'm talking about a toddler. What do? They fight to get up. If you try to hold somebody down, what do? They try to wiggle out. Nobody has to tell us to preserve our own life. We know that. You cannot not know that it is a good thing to preserve one's life. Nobody has to explain about procreation of the species. Nobody has to give a class that says, okay, you guys, you're going through puberty, a lot of hormones raging, so we need to let you know, we want you to procreate. Nobody talks like that, right? This is something that's natural to the human person. Now, there's something to add here, and we're going to call that education of the children, okay? Because we are not a species that give birth and then leave, right? That child is brought into a family and reared, so it's taught. We're not necessarily talking about formal education, although it could include that. We're just talking about the fact that the child is educated into the family, into the culture, right? We teach the child everything from manners to good and bad, right? Things that they may not be able to figure out on their own. The last one is to live in society. It is natural for us as an inclination to want to be with each other. So even when the West was being settled, people still had the urge and the inclination to live together. Now, we can argue about why, okay? So the Catholic Church says because we are interdependent, we need each other on many different levels, emotionally, spiritually, physically. Or the Enlightenment ideals, like John Locke, who says we live together out of mutual protection, right? So we can argue about why we live in society, but we do live in society. Some people say, again, why I like being by myself? Like we see those TV shows about people that live up in Alaska and there's no neighbor for 30 miles. Is it ever, is there anybody else pick up on the irony of the fact that they're on a national TV show? I mean, I've always wondered, yeah, you're a real recluse, Bring in the cameras and put me on TV. I'm more of a recluse than that, okay? These are the 5 natural inclinations, the primary precepts of natural law. These are the 5 things you cannot not know, all right? So, what did I say is the other way that it's imprinted on us? Rational knowledge. The secondary precepts are going to be a further application of the primary precepts. A further application of the primary precepts. So we are going to take the primary precepts with our rational knowledge. By understanding concepts and forming judgments, we are now going to come up with secondary precepts. So a further application of the primary precepts. I'm not going to give you an example for doing good. Anything that's, avoiding evil is doing good. So any example you could imagine, from stealing to hurting something. I mean, there's so many examples. It's not exclusive. But let's talk about examples of secondary precepts of seeking the truth. Why are you here? You're not just here to get a job or to go to college. You're here because there's a certain level of apathy that you are overcoming in your intellectual life. You're here because parents may say to you, you have the gift of intellect, you have the gift of voice, you have such a personality, you take care of other people, you need to be in the social fields or a nurse, you have such concern and empathy, right? The reason why people say you can't waste the gifts that are giving you, the reason why people say you can't be apathetic about your education is because we've taken rational knowledge and we've applied it to the primary precept of seeking the truth. Do you see how we just broadened it a little bit there? Okay. Because we know that you must preserve your own life, all right? So Ryan knows that she must preserve her own life. No one needs to tell her that, and no one needs to tell me that I must preserve my own life. So Ryan's just going to take a little bit more rational knowledge and apply that she can't harm me. Because if I have an inclination to preserve my life, then she has a duty to help me preserve my life, so she cannot harm me. Do you see how we can call murder wrong without really bringing, God or divine revelation into it? We do it as a secondary precept of natural law. We also say suicide is wrong, because if I cannot harm me, I therefore cannot kill myself. Mental illnesses aside, okay? Those would be secondary precepts based on bringing rational knowledge to bear on a primary precept. With procreation, anything that frustrates the natural end. So contraception, the word itself says against conception. It frustrates the natural end of procreation. It's not the same as birth control. We will get into this at some point. The Catholic Church is all for birth control. What is birth control? What does it say? Control your births. You're not an animal. We've already said that you have to, in other words, we don't have to give in to our instincts, right? We can bring reason to bear, so we can rise above the brute. That's why we're humans. Any voluntary sterile acts, which could include, but are not limited to, homosexuality, masturbation, things like that. They frustrate a procreative end. There's no way, in other words, there's no way to achieve the procreated end. All right? And the last one with living in society, I really didn't get specific. It's anything that works against solidarity. Solidarity is that mutual necessity we have, interdependence, right? So this could include all kinds of things. By the way, when we, in this morality class, we will not get into specifics because we can't. We will just have general principles that can be applied. So things that would work against solidarity would be government intrusion into the family. All right? It also could be a lack of good immigration policy. So, depending on what we're talking about, these things could all work against society. So the Catholic Church has developed, basically principles on each of those spectrums based on natural precepts. All right? The problem is, the reason why we're not getting into specifics in this class, and I'll just be honest with you, it's not because I'm fearful to go into controversial areas. We will do that. I don't know where to get good information. And I'll give you a for instance. Right now there's big debates about leaving certain Muslims from particular countries into this country, right? Because of a fear of vetting, not knowing if they're here to do us harm or not. And Switzerland now is in the news, right? Some groups are saying that they've let in a lot of immigrants and from Muslim countries, and it has not increased the crime. Other people are reporting saying, well, actually they reclassified the crime, so it looks like that, but actually rape has gone up so much percent. All right, that's like in a nutshell what the argument is. How do we know what the truth is? I don't know how we would do that. Where do we go for that information? We would sit here and argue over what we think, but we would never be able to come to a conclusion. So that's beyond the scope of a morality class. All we can do is have principles and talk about those. And then how that plays out in the culture, it's for people that have access to information that, and unfortunately, I'm cynical at this point, which you are too, after this last election cycle. Where do we go for good news? I don't know where that is. And I'm not saying that to be cynical. I honestly don't know where that is. Okay, so anyway, those are secondary precepts. Now there's one last precept in there called remote. Remote precepts, they are reasonable but they are difficult and not known by everyone. Okay, they are reasonable. There's nothing unreasonable about them, but they are difficult to know, and they're not known by everyone. Now, I only have 2 examples, and I can't go into them very deeply, but we'll go into these more if by chance you pick any of these in the modules that you choose. Just war theory. When is it justified for a country to go to war? There is criteria that has been worked out over time, right? It's based on secondary precepts, based on primary precepts. So you can see, why would a country go to war? Because they realize their citizens must preserve their lives, and they also believe that they have to protect them, because they have to help them in that endeavor. And if there's a particular threat to those people, then the country has a duty. The government literally has a duty to protect them. We could talk about the truth and goodness and living in society. All those things are brought to bear, okay? Another day, maybe we'll talk about the criteria. I don't want to get into it too much. Principle of double effect. And you don't really need to know what these things are at this point, just to know that they're remote precepts. I get into a lot of discussions about life issues, particularly abortion. So I had a friend once say to me, well, the only reason you're against abortion is because you're Catholic. So that's interesting. So I guess the only reason you're for it is because you're an atheist. I mean, you know, the reason why discussions like that never go anywhere is because you can see how shallow it is, right? Okay, so, yes?
I didn't hear when you put for reasonable that
Difficult, and not everybody knows it. So, I might hear something, and I have heard something. Well, Catholics don't care about the woman; they only care about the baby. You know, I don't know how you can really rationalize that out, but it sounds good when you're throwing it out there, I guess, to the person. In other words, you don't care if the mother dies; you just want to save the baby. You know, okay. As a moral theologian and philosopher, I can tell you that's 100% false. All right. And I'll give you a very specific, for instance, and I'm not going to give you all the criteria for the principle of double effect. If a woman has uterine cancer, and their physicians have come to the conclusion that she needs treatment now, or the likelihood of her surviving is not going to be good at all. But doing the treatment now could result, or may even absolutely result, in the death of the child. What does the Catholic Church say? Get the treatment. You're not killing the child. If the child's going to die, you're not killing the child. The child will die in the process as an effect of the woman being saved. And the life of the mother is certainly proportionate to the life of a child. One is not greater than the other, right? So, in a nutshell, that would be the conclusion. Now, when would you not be able to do something like that? Let's say a woman had elective surgery. I don't know, I'm making it up. She had particular cosmetic surgery she had planned, but now she's pregnant. And this doctor took forever to get in. But the doctor says, if you're pregnant and we do this, it could and likely will harm the child. No, you cannot have that kind of surgery. You know, whatever cosmetic thing you're talking about is not necessary. And it is certainly not proportional to a person dying, okay? So, anyway, these things, they're difficult, they're hard to know. Most people don't know much about them, but they have opinions on them, which, you know, kind of makes you wonder where they get their opinions from. But they are remote precepts. That is just a further application of the secondary precepts, which was rational knowledge being brought to bear on primary precepts. Any questions? All right. This is a quick slide. There's really nothing to lay out after that first line. Natural inclinations indicate... Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yes, there is. Natural inclinations indicate the end to which human actions are directed. Natural inclinations indicate the end to which human actions are directed. We are going to look at the natural inclination, and we're going to determine its end. If it's necessary for you and I to preserve our lives, then our human actions have to be directed towards the preservation of our lives. See how simple that is? If we are to seek the truth as a natural inclination, then that tells us that all of our laws and prescriptions have to be aimed towards us having the ability to seek the truth, which is why we have public education, by the way, all right? Mandatory public education. So what we say then, see, what we're doing here is we're determining the design of the human person, right? Like if I gave you a vacuum cleaner and didn't tell you what it was, once you figured it out, how would you have figured it out? You would look at the design. You would say, this really looks like something that you know, it sucks things up, it cleans things. And it's got a rotary tool. That must be for like throwing the stuff in the back. You know, this might be something that people use to clean. You would look at the design and try to figure out what to use this for. Right? Like reverse engineering, they might call it, right? So we're saying X, whatever X is, if it's proper for a human end, then X ought to be done. So if people's access to truth is proper for a human end, then we need to give them access to truth. The reverse is true also. If X is not proper for a human end, then X should not be done, right? So laws that would frustrate education and procreation in life should not be done, right? So we're just basically working off the design of the human person. So all we're doing is we're saying man's design points to man's end. So we'll take those 5 natural inclinations, we notice them in our design, and now we're going to say our ends have to be directed towards those, which means natural inclinations indicate the end to which human actions are directed. All right. Now, what is good about this? This allows Catholic morality to engage those out of the faith. In other words, I could teach about homosexual persons and abortion and never mention the Bible or the Catholic Church. I could talk about it in terms of ends and inclinations. All right? So this allows Catholic morality to engage those outside of the faith. That's why I call this a bridge to the world, or why it's called a bridge to the world. So this is the law that's written on the heart of man. You had that from Friday. It's imprinted into you. And just so you know, I'm not discounting divine revelation. Here's scripture. Romans 1:20, ever since the creation of the world, in his invisible nature, his power and deity, they can be perceived in the things that have been made. In other words, we can look at things that have been made and determine that God is present in this. He says then you're without excuse. Romans 2:12, St. Paul says, if you have sinned without the law, like if you're not a Jewish person and you've sinned, you're going to perish without it. Don't think it gets you away from anything. If you sinned because you were Jewish, then you're going to be judged according to that law. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, while their conscience bears witness. It's supposed to be and their conflicting thoughts accuse or perhaps excuse them. All right? So no excuses. This is something that's written on the heart of all men. So if a person does grow up, say in a remote area of Pakistan, and never has access to anything, Christian, somebody might say, well, that's not fair. Were they going to go to hell because they never could heard about Jesus? No. They'll be judged according to law written on their hearts. So I saw this video about a guy having his 9 and 10-year-old daughter and son to be a suicide bomber. They're not sure if they went through it. They think they did, but that's not the point. If somebody would make the argument, well, that's their culture. Preserving one's own life, living in society, going against truth, doing evil that good may come of it. You broke 4 of the natural inclinations right there. So if their argument would be, you're without excuse. You should have known. These are things you cannot not know. All right? And that goes for us too. I'm just using that as an example. Okay. We're a couple minutes ahead here, I'm glad. This is, I think, the more important part. So where has natural law been used? First, let's ask this. Is it a Catholic thing? There's no ... necessarily after it, except it need not be. This need not be a Catholic thing. But it typically is. Why? Protestant ethics, God bless you, does not have a very well developed understanding of natural And there's a reason. It's because they do not have a high opinion of human nature, okay? Protestant ethics does not have a high opinion of human nature. So go back to the sacraments course and remember what I told you about extrinsic and intrinsic justification, how the Catholic and the Orthodox believe that we are justified intrinsically, but all Protestant theology is based on extrinsic justification, which means the person is not interiorly transformed. So this does not mean that no Protestant does not accept natural law. A good friend of mine who's an ELCA minister does. Carl Broughton is a theologian in the ELCA church, but he's also almost a lone voice. He's a scholar who is okay with natural law, but most are not. So let me give you like a personal example of what I mean by low view of human reason. So I went to this traveling exhibit of the New York Museum of Natural History, and I was the only non-minister there. There was about 8 or 9 of us. I went there because I was invited. So when 2 of them found out that I had a philosophy background, they rolled their eyes. And one said, well, we really think that's worldly wisdom. All right, what am I going to do about that? So when they were talking about evolution and about the findings they've had, one minister literally took out his Bible and started shaking it at this paleontologist and said, this and this alone tells me how I get to heaven and the love of my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, not your theory of evolution. Okay. You can only imagine what I thought of all that. All right. There's not a lot of reasoning going on upstairs. I know it sounds cruel, but I don't know how else to say it. That's elementary. Okay. If you don't have a very high view of reason, then how are you going to bring it to bear on natural law? I'll give you another example. This was the president of the seminary over in Myerstown. He's now the president of the seminary Gordon Cromwell. This is a huge, huge seminary for Protestant evangelicals. I went to a conference that he gave at the Ephrata Hospital. There must have been 100 and some people. He was giving a conference on ethics and his new book. I was the only Catholic in the room, and I don't have, I'm not a cleric, so I have nothing that identifies me as such. He put up his criteria for what it means to be ethical. After he was done, he says, any questions? I raised my hand. I said, yeah, I have a question. I said, all the criteria you have up there means that you almost have to believe in Bible-believing person before you can be ethical. He goes, what do you mean? I said, how's an atheist ethical according to your system? How's a Muslim or a Jew or anybody? And he goes, oh, I understand what you mean. He goes, well, there is this Catholic thing, natural law, but we don't really, accept it very deeply. I went afterwards and talked to him. That's a problem. We can bridge this to the world. Okay, we can make this bridge to the world. Now let me show you historically where this has been used. Has anybody here read Antigone? You know the story, Antigone and Polynices. They're brothers, 2 brothers. One was fighting against King Creon. The other one was fighting for him. Okay, they both die. Creon says to the son, or the brother, who was fighting against him, that no one's allowed to bury him because their understanding was if he did not have a proper burial, he'd have no rest in the afterworld.
Oh yeah, I read it.
Okay, so Antigone and her sister are going to bury him, and this is their discussion. I'll play part of it here.
We have 2 brothers, both of them dead. And Creon has decreed that a decent burial shall be given to one, but not to the other. Eteocles apparently has already been buried with full military honours, not far short of a state funeral, with all the formalities due to the dead meticulously observed, so that his rest in the underworld amongst the heroes is assured. But Polynices, who died in agony just as certainly as his brother did, is not to be buried at all. The decree makes that quite plain. He is to be left, lying where he fell, with no tears or ceremonies of mourning, to stink in the open, till the kites and vultures catch the scent and tear him to pieces and pick him to the bone. Left unburied, there is no rest for him in the underworld, no more than here. What a great king our Creon is, eh, sister? It's against us, you realize, and against me in particular, that he has published this decree. And he'll soon be here himself to make it public to the senators and anyone who may not have heard it. He isn't bluffing. He means to act, to make it stick. The punishment for anyone who disobeys the order is public stoning to death. So that's the news. And you know it now. The time has come for you, too, to stand up and be counted with me, to show whether you are worthy of the honor of being Oedipus' daughter.
Wait a minute, Antigone. Don't be so headstrong. If all this is as you say it is, what can I do, one way or the other?
Just say you'll help me. Commit yourself.
To do what? Something dangerous?
Just to give me a hand to lift the body. It's too heavy for me to move on my own.
To bury him, you mean, in spite of the decree?
He's my brother. And whatever you say, he's yours, too. I won't betray him now that he's dead. No one will ever throw that in my face.
You can't do it. Crayon has publicly forbidden it.
Cannot forbid me to love my brother. He has neither the right nor the power to do that.
That's the important part. He has neither the right nor the power. This goes against natural law. All right? It's a classic example. George Mason's argument before the General Court of Virginia. Listen to this. It's a politician. The law of nature, that's the law of God. And that authority cannot be superseded by any power on earth. Wouldn't that be something to hear a politician say that today? There is no law on earth that can supersede the law of nature. Not the law that we find out in the natural world, the law of the nature of the human person. All right? Yeah. Sure. Nuremberg trial. After World War II, here's Hermann Göring. He was initially founded the Gestapo, then moved on to the Luftwaffe. Certainly held responsible for many of the atrocities that occurred during World War II. Unfortunately, he broke no laws because Germany had no laws against what he did. So it wasn't the first time that they used this, but he was brought up on charges of crimes against humanity. That had to be developed from natural law. It wasn't like an international law that they can appeal to. And he was also brought up on war crimes. He was sentenced to death and sentenced to be hanged, and he took a cyanide tablet the night before his execution. All right? Natural law arguments are all brought to bear. Now, I have the audio of this. Martin Luther King Jr. Has anybody read his letter from Birmingham prison? You will read it. You have? Good for you. This is like Solzhenitsyn's address to the 1978 graduating class of Harvard. It's something you should not leave here without having read. So let me preface it before I play it for you. Martin Luther King Jr. was absolutely opposed to violence. I think you know that. He also was absolutely opposed to breaking the law. But he did break the law and he was put into prison. So people were saying, you hypocrite. You said that you should be law-abiding and yet you break the law. So his response is eloquent to say the least. Now, he's a Baptist minister. You may be thinking, I thought you said that Protestants have a low regard for reason as it's applied to natural law. He happened to get his PhD at Boston University, a Catholic university. Listen to him make the argument using Augustine and Aquinas, Paul Tillich, Martin Buber. If we had a politician like this today, how good would we be? And I don't think we've had one in the last 20-some years easily.
You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break law. This is certainly a legitimate concern, since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954, outlawing segregation in the public schools. At first glance, it may seem rather paradoxical for us consciously to break laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal, but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God.
It's the eternal law.
An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. Segregation, to use the terminology of the Jewish philosopher Martin Luther, substitutes an I-it relationship for an I-thou relationship, and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. Hence, segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, it is morally wrong and sinful. Paul Tillich has said that sin is separation. It's not segregation, an existential expression of man's tragic separation, his awful estrangement, his terrible sinfulness. Thus it is that I can urge men to obey the 1954 decision of the Supreme Court, for it is morally right, and I can urge them to disobey segregation ordinances, for they are morally wrong. Let us consider a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. An unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey, but does not make binding on itself. This is difference made legal.
I talked about that on
By the
Friday.
same
Okay, so as an aside, I have one more thing here. As an aside, could you imagine not taking the philosophy or theology? How would he ever come to those conclusions? You know, I know it's popular in colleges now to push the humanities down, get the sciences up. This is what I think comes at stake, because this also affects our national dialogue, all right? So the point is this. The fact that some people say what is or is right or wrong is determined by one's culture, that there are no standards, natural law refutes that. If you were a cultural relativist, what would you have said against Nazism? You certainly would have had an argument against Martin Luther King Jr. So natural law, the fact that it's written on all the hearts of men, refutes the cultural relativism. Any questions?